How's it going guys, Chris here, bringing you a complete guide to all of those Naytiba enemy types in Stellar Blade. So basically all the monsters and creatures you'll be fighting throughout the game. There's loads of different Naytiba variants in Stellar Blade, all falling into their own categories. And I'm going to be running through all of those in this guide, focusing on the weaker enemies first and ending up on the more challenging bosses a little bit later on. So one of the most simplistic enemies you'll face in Stellar Blade, the Fawnhead is pretty much the first Naytiba minion you'll need to deal with, found right at the start of the game and then later on as you progress. It's basically a nasty worm chicken with a head covered in spiny thorns, so it's pretty easy to see where this guy gets his name from. And unsurprisingly, it's going to swing that head around like a mace, using its stretchy, elastic-like body to reach out and knock you around in close quarters, as it paces towards you on those funny little legs. Like the many of the Naytiba types you'll face, Fawnheads are violent and aggressive, but being such small, slow creatures without many ways to attack, these should be easy to take down on their own. A little bit tougher in groups, with them all swinging those heads around like they're at a Slayer gig, but otherwise simple enough compared to a lot of the other nasties you'll be up against. Probably one of the game's most common enemies is the Creeper, which is basically like a cross between a scorpion and a droidica, a bug-type creature that mainly uses its razor-sharp tail to stab you up close. Now these things shouldn't pose much of a problem on their own, with their attacks being quite weak and their health being pretty low, allowing you to wipe them out in just a few swings of your blade. More often than not though, these things tend to show up in groups, making them trickier to take on, with you having multiple enemies to keep an eye on. Creepers will mainly scurry around, resorting to tail jabs most of the time, but do keep in mind that they can also tuck their legs and tail in to form a wheel-like shape, letting the creeper move around quicker, use dash attacks against its prey, or even take one for the team and self-destruct as it rolls towards you, turning itself into a deadly homing missile. A slightly bigger minion comes in the form of the Mite, another strange looking creature, only one with a huge bulbous head and rat-like features, having a pair of furry legs and a long whip-like tail, used as a weapon just like the Creeper. Unlike the Creeper though, the Mite chooses to wave that tail around instead of jabbing it forwards, combining tail lashes with tackle attacks and headbutts to disrupt your combos and chip away at that health. Despite having a clumsy looking body structure, Mites can actually be quite agile, able to dodge your blade strikes while dashing around on those powerful legs. Once again being a relatively easy enemy to take on individually, having a low health pool and simple attacks, but one that might be more of a challenge when backed up by a few buddies, all working together to wear you down bit by bit. Aside from the basic Mite though, you'll also bump into the mutated variant, basically looking like a giant wandering bogey, having the same sort of features as the standard one, only now being filled with poisonous liquid carried in its head, along with huge blisters sprouting from its legs and tail. These unstable mutated Mites generally act in a very similar way to their basic counterparts, using the same sort of attacks and maneuvers, though you'll now have to watch out for them spraying poison and exploding in a shower of toxic liquid as a last resort effort to take you down with them. Another creature that looks and acts a lot like the Mites is the Boarlet, but these guys live in the barren lands, competing with each other for food. Unlike the Mites, the Boarlets have big spikes all over them, which not only gives them a bit of a nastier appearance, but also gives them something to jab you with, as they roll over in your direction, trying to hit you with those spines. Aside from looking a bit funkier though, these guys use a lot of the same sort of attacks and behaviour patterns as the Mites, jumping around in an unpredictable way to avoid your blade slashes, while headbutting and tail whipping you in close range, often accompanied by other Boarlets in the area, helping to assist each other in the fight. Though being weak enemies, they shouldn't really pose too much of a problem. One of the weirdest Naytiba minions you'll face is basically a huge tentacle that shoots up from the ground and starts acting angry towards you. Now these tentacles aren't part of something bigger, so you're not going to be winding up the Kraken or anything, as they all act as their own individual entities, having their own brain made up from a clump of cells. But unlike a lot of the other minions, these things can soak up quite a lot of damage, being coated in thick skin, while being strong enough to punch through tough materials and armour, letting them deal some reasonable damage should they hit you. It's worth pointing out that they can't reposition, so when they pop up, you can just avoid them if you want to preserve some health, though you'll want to be a bit more careful around the overgrown variants, being much stronger than the smaller ones, while having even more reach with those swipes and slams. Easily one of the creepiest Naytiba minions in the game is the Test Subject, which is essentially a failed experiment discarded in a body bag to prevent biochemical contamination. Of course, the Naytiba have contaminated these test subjects, which now go on to hunt you down whenever they appear, eerily shuffling their way towards you, only to self-destruct into a shower of fiery blood as they get up close, taking one for the team and basically acting like a proximity bomb. They'll drop down from the ceilings and turn up unexpectedly, and because of their explosive nature, it's generally best to take them out with your gun over distance, quickly dashing away if you get within the blast radius of one, with you only having a brief moment to escape before detonation. Test subjects aren't exactly hard enemies to deal with, but in hectic fights or within claustrophobic spaces, they can definitely create problems and amp up the tension. The Skullin is a mutated Naytiba that looks a little bit like Davy Jones's head wriggling around on the floor, having a bit of an octopus-like appearance, with several small tentacles protruding from its body. These things often attack in small groups, using some fairly predictable slam attacks, which are easy to dodge or block. Their own attacks aren't really something you'll need to worry about, but you might need to worry about them contaminating nearby corpses like a parasite, giving it a stronger body to attack you with, able to transform into several tougher Naytiba variants, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the guide. Though if you see them wriggling around in the area, it's definitely best to kill them quickly, before they get a chance to latch onto a host and transform it into a much deadlier enemy. So one of the most messed up looking things in Stellar Blade comes in the form of the Lesser Lurker, the early form of another creature which we'll be taking a little look at later on. Looking like something you'd probably find down in the butchers, these monsters clumsily waddle around on a pair of fleshy legs, armed with a head like a Venus flytrap, with its entire body being completely split down the middle to form a huge gaping jaw, choosing to slap you around with its spiky mouth flaps to dish out the pain. They're a bit quicker than some of the other minions, so you'll need to take them down fast to avoid getting overwhelmed. Not exactly the toughest enemies like most of the other minions, but still probably something that you shouldn't underestimate, as they'll be having the last laugh if they manage to get you into a corner and slap you senseless. A bit later on in the game, you're going to encounter quite a few different types of Naytiba infected droids, and of course, we'll be checking out all of those a bit further on in the guide. But some of these droids have been severely damaged and practically sliced in half, with their torsos still able to crawl around, having their control and power systems housed within that upper section. It's obviously far more limited to what it can actually do, but its built-in survival programming keeps the droid running, allowing it to clamber around and attack hostiles by lunging forwards. They're extremely slow moving, and their strikes aren't particularly deadly, but nevertheless, broken droids can still throw you off guard and potentially complicate fights with other Naytiba types, especially when they decide to grab you, putting you in a much more vulnerable position against those tougher foes. Not all of the enemies you'll come across will be out for blood, as the A drone acts to assist other enemies in the area, healing them once they've been damaged, using a tank of medical fluid housed on its top. They sort of resemble flying saucers with a load of alien tentacles sprouting out from the base, looking a little bit like Kang and Kodos from The Simpsons. Though because they're more of a supportive enemy type, you're generally best getting rid of them first, as they'll otherwise prolong fights with other Naytiba by keeping them topped up with health. Though just because they're medical drones doesn't mean they're completely safe to be around, as if there's no host around for it to heal, the drone's going to drift towards you and self-destruct, as a last-ditch effort to try and take you down with it, no longer able to fulfill its primary objective. There's quite a few robots in the game, but one of the creepiest comes in the form of the Kokeshi. Weird little crab droids with doll faces that are just about as hostile as they look. They crawl around low to the ground, generally spawned in by other larger Naytiba types, all working together to try and overwhelm you and disrupt your movement. Unlike most of the other minion variants that typically rush towards you and smack you around, these things have got a few of the tricks up their sleeves, being able to fire small energy beams, giving them power over range, and also having the ability to charge at you and self-destruct, forcing you to run away and reposition, possibly breaking your flow of combat, making fights just that little bit more awkward. Not to mention their attacks can also temporarily disable your burst and beta abilities, which could be problematic if you're relying on it to take care of a tougher Naytiba fighting alongside them. So onto the tougher warrior Naytiba types, and pretty much the first one you'll see right at the start of the game, and in several other areas throughout, is a creature called the Beholder. Tall, twisted looking thing with a bit of a humanoid shape, but still far from looking human. These guys have quite a few unique features, as aside from that distorted body, they'll stare you out with a singular glowing yellow eye, and attempt to slice you up with a saw blade arm made from solid bone, with that being its primary weapon to counter your own blade. Aside from looking pretty wild, Beholders are fairly straightforward enemies with standard slashing attacks, relying on that bone saw arm to do most of the damage against you. They're not exactly the quickest Naytiba types, so their attacks can be fairly easy to read and avoid, often waving its arm around slowly, giving you plenty of time to try and parry or dodge incoming swings. So creepers are certainly one of the game's more common minions, especially earlier on in the game, but you'll also need to watch out for the stronger mutated variant, distinguishable by having bright yellow spots covering their bodies, but more obviously being a lot bigger than those weaker counterparts. As you might be able to guess, these creepers are generally tougher, more aggressive Naytibas with stronger attacks and higher health pools, often found on their own, or guarding groups of smaller minion variants, choosing to fight with them and use their numbers to distract and overwhelm you. You'll need to watch out for a lot of similar attacks, along with a few new ones thrown into the mix, able to jab at you with that longer tail, but also swing it around too, combining tail attacks with spinning charges to knock you down without the creeper exploding, using itself as a powerful battering ram rather than a self-destructing bomb like the others. Along your journey, you'll also encounter the barnacle, which is essentially a weird cricket type thing with a huge shell-covered leg. That leg can soak up a lot of the damage you'll inflict, so you'll need to be a bit smarter about attacking these guys head on, having much better defense than a lot of the other Naytiba types, being able to block strikes from the fronts with that giant shield. Barnacles don't just use that shell for protection either, with it doubling up as a chunky blunt weapon to bash you over the head with, smacking you all over the place while slamming it down to flatten you close by. Attacking the barnacle from behind is a no-brainer, letting you deal damage to its exposed side, though parrying and stunning the creature will also temporarily push that shield aside, opening it up to attacks from the front too. A fairly tricky enemy to deal with earlier on, but not too bad once you learn its movements and know when to counter its strikes. Speaking of bug-looking monsters, our next Naytiba type happens to be the cricket boomer, another insect-style creature with a shelled body and long insect limbs. These things have a tall, slender stature, though having their arms folded to cover its torso, their primary way to dish out the damage is by launching acidic goo at you over distance. Projectiles which are fairly easy to avoid, and if you time it right, deflect to send it flying back to the cricket to use its own weapon against it. They're not exactly tough enemies to deal with on their own, being completely vulnerable to your blade attacks up close, but when grouped together or assisting other enemies, these flying blobs of orange phlegm can be another thing you'll need to watch out for in a hectic fight. You'll also need to watch out for cricket boomers exploding too, as they're just about to die, so it's best not to get too carried away in a slashing combo, keeping some healthy distance if they're about to go off. Another cricket variant comes in the form of the slasher, generally a trickier enemy to deal with that chooses to unfold those arms, and as the name implies, slash you up with them. These things kinda look like bug necromorphs, waving around a pair of long spiky arms clambering towards you to slash and jab you up close. You've got to be careful of an extra hidden arm that the slasher has though, which can erupt from its torso once its shield's been depleted, knocking out huge chunks of health if you're nearby to the eruption, while also giving the creature much faster, more relentless combos thereafter, punishing you if you get caught off guard. Most of the time, you'll see them wandering around aimlessly, but they can also be sneaky buggers at times, choosing to hide around corners and swipe at you as you walk on by. Just be a bit careful in areas where there's a lot of them around. So the last variant in the cricket family that you'll need to watch out for is probably the nastiest one of them all. The Butcher is a little bit like the Slasher, only a lot more vicious, with this guy having 4 spiny arms to slice, grab and stab you with, also throwing special attacks into the mix, which need to be avoided by using blink and repulse abilities. You can tell these guys apart from the other crickets due to those fancy red and black stripes all over their bodies, along with having those 4 arms flailing around in your direction too of course. They're not necessarily deadlier crickets than the Slasher variants, but they do throw more attacks and different combos at you, which is more prone to throwing you off guard, forcing you to be more prepared for what they might do next. So crickets can be a bit sneaky at times, but Guardians are practically disguised as environmental statues, having its flesh, muscles and tissue hidden beneath its hard stone-like skin. You'll find a lot of Guardian statues in some areas, and a lot of them are just simply made of stone like they're supposed to be. Though Guardian Naytibas, imitating the same statues, also like to lie in wait amongst them, to pounce on you as you wander on by. So if there's a lot of statues in the area, you might be best giving your scanner a ping to highlight those crafty ones. When they're not chilling out pretending to be a rock, they'll be attacking you with long-winded but potentially deadly punches and sword jabs, using somewhat predictable movements due to those slow but steady lunges. Just be careful not to get grabbed, as it's not going to be very good for your back. There's also a beefed up variant of the statue guys, with those being the heavy Guardians, standing taller than the others with their left arm being morphed into a spiky mace-like club, all the better for bashing you in the face. It's no surprise to hear that these Naytibas are more powerful than their standard counterparts, boasting heavier attacks while being able to withstand more damage, and you'll need to be aware of faster, more relentless combos which can be tricky to read and block, combining vicious arm swipes with overhead slams and charges. Because of their extra height and power, they're also a bit steadier on their feet, not quite as prone to getting staggered like the smaller ones are. So if you see one of these guys plodding around nearby, just expect them to put up a bit more of a fight. This nicely leads me over to the last of the statue warriors, with the Cannon Guardian being more of a ranged enemy, having a big alien wasp nest looking thing plopped on its head, which it uses to launch projectiles at you through the air. It's a Naytiba that's undergone violent mutation, allowing it to develop and spit out explosive balls, and lacking any sort of powerful melee weapon, the Cannon Guardians solely rely on that big bomb head to do most of the work for them. These bombs are often fired in clusters, littering the area, thus making it harder to advance on the Guardian as they scatter all over the floor, or the explosives can be shot out individually, giving the Guardian a bit more accuracy instead. Either way, keep an eye out for when it starts to have a little dance, as that usually means it's run out of ammo, giving you a nice opportunity to rush in and hack the thing to pieces while it's reloading those glowy balls. Now a very unique creature is the Hydra, a Naytiba warrior with quite a few interesting characteristics, aside from looking like a giant flying starfish that is. The Hydra can float around and move like it's swimming through the air by manipulating magnetic fields, giving it a bit of a graceful appearance, until it starts swishing down and barrel rolling itself into your head, that is. Although it might initially look like a big mass of flying tentacles, the creature sort of flies around side on, with its underside facing you and its mermaid-like upper torso jutting out from the other, which kinda makes sense with the underside having all those sharp barbs and nasty spikes to deal damage to you. To complement those dash and stab attacks, the Hydra's also got the ability to camouflage itself too, easily rectified by scanning the area to reveal the sneaky Hydra swishing around and readying itself up for another attack. If the normal Hydras weren't troublesome enough, you've also got to contend with the mutated variants, which look very similar to the standard ones, aside from having brighter colours, though can now also throw some ranged attacks into the mix as well. Mutated Hydras not only like to spit out acid blobs over distance, but they're also a fair bit faster, and tend to switch on that invisibility cloak a tad more often too. This gives them a pretty wide variety of ways to attack, covering practically all ranges, with the creature using all the same sort of tricks as the basic Hydra, though doing so more effectively, while giving you something else to watch out for as you try and close the gap. Those acid blobs pack more of a punch than you'd probably think, with volleys of shots being able to rip through your health in a matter of seconds, and with the Hydra being so agile and floaty, it's quite prone to retreating to rely on those projectiles more often. One of the chunkiest Naytiba warriors comes in the form of the Dozer, which is basically a giant alien ram, armed with a massive hammerhead style slab on its head for bowling you over and mashing you into the dirt. They've got a very wacky appearance, and their overall size makes them quite intimidating, compared to a lot of the other warrior type Naytibas anyway, almost looking like a mini boss. Having a thick hide makes them quite durable to your attacks, while those 4 muscular legs let the Dozer dash around and use speed to its advantage too. With all that said, they're pretty damn stupid creatures, limited to doing simple headbutts and ramming attacks, many of which are well telegraphed and fairly easy to dodge and parry. You've got to watch out for them slamming the ground to create shockwaves on the floor, and generally watch out for them swinging that head around and using it as a giant battering ram. By the way, it's always best to watch out for those blinker repulse opportunities, if you want to use some of its own deadly attacks against it. Like many of the other Naytiba types, the Baller also has a mutated variant too, which falls under the warrior category despite the fact that it looks and acts in a very similar way to its minion version. This one's got a fancy paint job though, with black and white stripes covering its body, making it easier to distinguish. But it's also got the same spiky ball head and rat legs that the others have, generally doing the same sort of thing too. It's definitely angrier than the normal ones, using more tail whips and throwing unblockable rolling strikes into the mix, but as far as ballets go, these mutated variants don't really bring too much else to the table, using a lot of the same sort of attacks as the normal guys, without having anything particularly menacing you'll need to watch out for. Once a ballet's eaten enough food and harnessed enough power, it swells up and transforms into a hedge ball, a big bulky humanoid creature with loads of spikes covered all over its face. Now these enemies are much more dynamic than a lot of the others, wielding a pair of handheld melee weapons attached to chains, sort of looking a little bit like a mutated alien version of Roadhog from Overwatch, using a variety of violent attack combos and flurries. Because those weapons are chained to the hedgeball's wrists, this also makes them extendable too, allowing them to be swung and lashed around, giving the creature extra reach within shorter ranges, making some attacks trickier to avoid, forcing you to either dodge or parry them to escape unscathed. They're pretty clumsy, dopey creatures, but all that excess fat and muscle gives them a lot more stability in combat, with hedgeballs being less prone to staggering effects, and generally being better at staying in the action. Definitely a nice upgrade from being a ballet. So we all know how much plants and zombies hate each other, but what would you get if you mashed the two together? Well, you'd probably wind up getting something like the Waster, which basically looks like some sort of demonic flower monster, having a freakishly long neck, disfigured body, and a face that belongs in the upside down. The Naytiba contamination hasn't been very kind to this thing, mutilating its body and essentially chopping it in half, leaving it to crawl around on its hands. In a way, they've got similar characteristics to the fawnhead Naytibas, in the way they move and attack, whipping their heads around by using those stretchy snake-like necks, giving you a good smack if you happen to be nearby. That's the way they typically prefer to attack, though if you're just out of their reach, the Waster can also spew up acidic liquid from that nasty flower face, and spit that over distance too, which can be deflected back to the creature with a well-timed parry. Some of the droids you'll find in the game are quite literally walking guns, with thousands of these things being sent to landfills for scrap, only for the Naytiba to contaminate them and basically take them under their control. These turret droids might be old and rusty, but they can still cause you problems, unsurprisingly over range, with their heads being cannons, doubling up as a machine gun and a railgun, allowing the droid to fire a variety of different things, from standard bullet fire to concentrated energy beams, which sweep around in circular patterns and zap everything in the area. If that's not enough firepower, there's also a sneaky missile launcher slapped on there too, blasting rockets into the air which can lock onto your current position, leaving behind fiery puddles when they land. These droids aren't too much of a hassle on their own, being extremely vulnerable when you close the gap, which is probably why they tend to group up together, often seen travelling around in small convoys. Speaking of turrets, a lot of them were installed to protect humanity during the final war, with stationary turrets made to guard bridges, roads, military bases and other facilities of importance. Much like everything else that could be weaponized, the Naytiba contamination found its way into these abandoned guard turrets, forcing them to turn on the people they were once designed to defend. They function very differently to typical enemies in Stellar Blade, often placed high up or in out of reach areas, forcing you to either gun them down over distance to prevent them from attacking, or simply by avoiding incoming fire by taking cover in between shots, which have a rapid velocity and can deal punishing amounts of damage if you get hit by them, killing you outright if you're fairly low on health. With technology advancing at such a fast pace throughout the mid-21st century, older droid models were quickly becoming obsolete, with many being discarded and sent to scrapyards to make way for the newer updated versions. These old security droids therefore became great hosts for the Naytiba to infect, armed with deadly staffs charged up with electricity, which they'll swing and twirl around to deliver some destructive melee combos. They're definitely not the simplest of enemies to face, with their attack patterns being trickier to read than some of the other Naytiba types, waving that weapon around at varying speeds while having several different staff combos for you to watch out for. And to make matters worse, they're often guarded by those pesky turret droids too, complicating fights as they try and blast you away over distance, while the old droid rushes in for some close quarter combat instead. A pretty creepy enemy up next. The Infector sort of looks like the kind of thing you'd see shambling around on the USG Ishimura, bringing an element of horror into the game, being mutated scientists overtaken by the Naytiba. They sort of act like alien zombies in hazmat suits, with their right arms morphed into a scythe-like appendage, and their heads and bodies covered in nasty red growths. And they're going to use those mutated arms to slash away at you, or attempt to grab a hold and give you a painful bite. They're not the fastest enemies in the world, and their attacks are fairly easy to predict and dodge, which is why they often like to use the element of surprise to try and get the better of you. Though to take them out efficiently, you're best shooting at the explosive pouch dangling from their waists. If that doesn't kill them outright, it'll at least do some serious damage, allowing you to follow up with shots to the head to finish them off for good. Another creepy monster type found in the same sort of areas as the Infector is the Defiler. Another human experiment gone horribly wrong, with the Naytiba mutating these scientists even further. Defilers have a tall, gangly stature with stretched out limbs, with the only source of humanity left being the original scientist's skull, showing through the creature's busted up helmet, as a stark reminder that these guys were once actually people. Also having scythe-like arms lets the monster swipe away at you up close, also able to puke out acidic blobs at you over range to cover multiple distances. Though killing them doesn't mean that you're out of the woods yet, with Defilers carrying those self-destructing test subjects on their backs, which drop down upon death and crawl towards you for one final attempt to take you down. You're best aiming for those explosive packs on the Defiler's body, along with the weak spot found on its head, putting them out of action nice and easy. If you thought those poor scientists couldn't get any more messed up, enter the mutated Defiler, which looks and acts in a similar way to its standard counterpart, only being subjected to even heavier mutation. These guys have had even more of their human features stripped away, replaced by Naytiba biomatter, having a head split open to form a plant-like mouth, with their bodies covered in lots of small alien tentacles. Mutated variants do all the same sort of things as the basic ones, slashing around their arms, spewing out yellow blobs, while dropping those test subjects upon death. But they're also a bit more aggressive than the others, and they're also prone to charging, and even grappling you close by, grabbing a hold and attempting to violently chomp away on your head, generally being a slightly deadlier version of the normal Defiler. Our next enemy is basically a big grotesque blob of flesh called the Hive, an Naytiba that doesn't generally attack you much, but instead acts as a path-blocking barrier, with the creature using a bunch of meaty tendrils to suspend itself in the air. Aside from being a bit of a pesky thing that needs to be destroyed to pass through certain areas, Hives also have the ability to spawn smaller minion Naytibas, which will do the dirty work for the Hive, basically helping to protect it, with the creature otherwise being a sitting duck, wide open to your attacks. You've got to slash away at the Hive while dealing with the minions it spits out, occasionally jumping backwards to avoid the hive puking acidic bile all over your head. And when you eventually dish out enough damage, well, this will cause it to explode into a shower of meaty chunks. It's worth pointing out that some of them also like to spit out bombs instead of minions, and can be killed by blasting away nearby explosives, though these guys aren't quite as common. A bit later on in the game you'll encounter another variant of the hive, called the Machine Hive, which is the same sort of creature, only fused with a bunch of broken robots and machine parts. It's essentially a hybrid of monster flesh and metal, an abomination with similar characteristics to the normal hives, only now able to spit out bombs and non-organic minions, like the Kakeshi robots, which can be a tad tricky to deal with while you're focusing on trying to slash the hive into pieces. In the same way as the basic hives, they don't really have many ways to defend themselves against your attacks, aside from occasionally discharging electrical pulses, forcing you to back off, and not get too carried away with those blade combos, unless you want to get zapped. Remember those slithery little skullins from earlier on? Well, now we're going to check out what happens when they contaminate nearby corpses. After latching onto a head and taking control of its mind, the Skullin can reanimate a once dead body and use it to move and attack more efficiently, now having a lot more power and strength than its previous form. One of the most common variants of these Skullin transformations is the Skull Trooper, a pretty bog standard hammer wielding enemy that typically waves that weapon around, lunging towards you and sometimes going into a bit of a frenzy, using random combos to try and catch you out. You might look a bit clumsy, but they're still capable of doing some damage, though once you've eventually killed the trooper, do keep in mind that the Skullin controlling it is going to detach itself and dive across the room to try and infect another body to repeat the whole process yet again. Obviously you'll want to hack the little bugger up before it gets the chance. If the Skullin latches onto a body and turns it into a Skull Fighter, then you're going to be tested even more, with these guys having access to a huge axe-like spear weapon designed to cause some serious damage. The Skull Fighter is basically a tougher variant of the Trooper, using powerful strikes and slashes which can knock out some hefty chunks from your health bar, while being a tad trickier to counter too, with the awkward size and momentum of those weapon swings making the timing of parries and dodges just that little bit harder to judge. Skull Fighters are pretty ruthless, attacking with full force and tons of aggression, making them very deadly opponents to tackle head on, having lots of powerful melee attacks that you'll need to watch out for. Definitely worth taking advantage of that blink ability whenever you get a chance. Though a slightly different and arguably more annoying variant of the Skullin enemies is the Skull Gunner, which chooses to stand back a bit from all the chaos and take you on by firing projectiles over range instead. The creature's arm is morphed into an organic gun which can blast out gooey blobs that travel through the air, fast enough to give your reflexes a test, but still steady enough to be avoidable, with you even able to send those projectiles flying back to the gunner if you can just about tap the block button at the right time. They're not exactly brutal enemies to be up against when they're alone, having limited ways to attack up close, but when they're assisting other enemies, the Skull Gunners can definitely pose more of a problem, with those shots being harder to see coming as they eat into your health and disrupt your flow of combat. But one of the most badass variants of the Skullin Bros is the Berserker, a much bulkier enemy than the others with a lot more strength and raw power. So much in fact, they like to rip up concrete pillars and use them as giant battering rams. The Berserkers are strong enough to wave these pillars around and hold them up high to deliver some devastating overhead slam attacks, and although they're essentially swinging around a huge chunk of stone, their attacks come at you surprisingly fast, despite having long wind-up times, making combos a bit tricky to read and counter effectively. These awkward movements can easily throw you off guard in a fight, allowing the Skull Berserker to completely butcher your health bar if you're not careful, so it's generally wise to advance with caution, and only strike when there's a good opportunity to do so, with Skull Berserkers being a lot more durable and less prone to being stunned after your attacks. When a lesser lurker grows up, it transforms into a much more powerful creature, capable of burrowing into the ground and using the element of surprise against its prey. Lurkers have a pair of chunky tentacles replacing their head, along with a bunch of long razor-sharp claws for swiping at their enemies and ripping them to shreds up close. You've got to pay close attention to the floor in areas where these guys are commonly found, looking for dust getting kicked up by their underground movements, as they'll rapidly travel towards you for a sneaky pounce attack. Using the combination of those claws and face tentacles in a fight allows the lurker to be aggressive while rushing forwards, using burrowing moves in tandem with his attacks to throw you off guard or relocate mid-battle. Speed is the key when taking lurkers on, as you need to act fast when they decide to pop up out of the blue. If you come across one of the darker variants with yellow tentacles, these guys are going to give you even more of a fight, being slightly stronger, capable of using projectiles, and also able to throw in one last surprise attack before they die. Just make sure you remember to jump out of the way. One of the strangest looking things you'll come across is a huge alien lion type creature called the Lesser Behemoth, essentially the children of fully grown behemoths, which we'll be taking a look at a little bit later on in the guide. These lesser variants might be a lot weaker in comparison, but they're still a hell of a lot bigger than your average Naytiba Warrior, using a lot of powerful claw swipes, flurries and pounce attacks to try and overwhelm their target. Being such a hefty creature, it's naturally got a pretty big health pool, but with that said, the lesser behemoth still gives you quite a lot of opportunities to deal damage and get some good combos in, being a pretty clumsy beast that tends to fall down a lot, while also being a bit slow to chain attacks together one after the other. They might look quite intimidating, but they're not quite as threatening as they first might seem, though you'll still need to respect the fact that they are giant monster cats, with their hits being punishing and potentially fatal if you're low on health. Much like the hives, cocoons are basically Naytibas that need to be killed to get through areas and progress toward your objective. They take the form of large biological pillars made of hardened clumps of cells, and they're generally considered to be a pest, which multiplies and sponges off the land while contaminating it at the same time. Think of them like giant alien weeds that need to be ripped out. Being able to launch tons of deadly acidic bile into the sky give them anti-air projectiles, which can target flying vehicles, posing a big problem for your ship passing through certain areas safely. So these cocoons therefore need to be destroyed, often guarded by other Naytiba to try and prevent you from doing so. Cocoons don't really go out of their way to directly harm you, acting like a plant rooted into the ground, but they'll still attempt to defend themselves by releasing spiny needles as you slash away at them, something you'll need to dodge to avoid taking damage. With Naytibas capable of taking control of robotic machines, some of the more advanced models have also fallen victim to contamination, one of those being the Houndborg, a quadrupedal dog-like robot once used for search and reconnaissance purposes. These things might be heavily armoured, but they're also lightning fast in the way they move and attack, charging at their target while performing rapid slashing attacks using their sharp knife-like heads, which can be swung around in quick succession to chip away at your health, sometimes throwing in the odd surge attack to lunge at you from further away. Because Houndborg strikes are quite sudden without much indication, this makes them trickier to predict and counter, not good when there's a couple of them hunting you down at once, putting even more pressure on you to stay vigilant. Houndborg fights can definitely be a test of patience at times. The Sentryborg is another contaminated machine which is basically an old turret system, capable of walking around and gunning their targets down using bullets and rockets. They've got pretty lengthy cooldown periods in between firing shots, but having the power to attack over range allows them to be disruptive when you're fighting other enemies, with them being a bit more vulnerable when you're taking them on by themselves. Bullets can be fired in single shots or volleys, and missile strikes will litter the area in front of the Sentryborg with explosives, pushing you back and forcing you to keep a bit of distance to avoid getting blown to pieces. The robot doesn't rely solely on all that firepower though, also having access to a deadly metallic tail, used to whip around in close range to protect itself from oncoming attackers, just like you. These tail strikes are pretty easy to read though, so the Sentryborg's going to be at its most vulnerable when you've closed the gap. Despite being such a simple enemy on the face of it, the basic droid can still potentially be dangerous, being standard, lightly armoured combat units, fitted with an energy blade to engage in close quarter fights. You can see the Naytiba corruption spilling out of these guys, looking like guts hanging down from the robot's stomach, forcing these once dormant machines to reanimate, becoming a vessel for the Naytiba's bidding. You can expect them to throw a lot of sword slashes at you, with that arm blade being their primary weapon, waving it back and forth to try and slap around nearby targets. These attacks are fairly simple and predictable, not really putting you under too much pressure, though you might want to keep in mind that killing one doesn't always put the droid out of action completely, with you sometimes chopping the robot in half, only for it to still come crawling after you once it's downed, basically turning it into a broken droid minion that'll hunt you down until it's destroyed. Some of the droids you run into have been armed with reinforced shields, powered up with energy to give the droid both offensive and defensive benefits. These heavy droids look and function in a very similar way to the basic ones, but having that shield lets them integrate new attacks and combos into the mix, also helping them block strikes from the front, generally making it a trickier fight. They'll use that shield in several different ways, being able to deflect some of your attacks, sometimes occasionally charging at you to bash you around as they rush forwards. That shield's going to block a lot of damage, so you'll therefore need to find ways to flank the robot, attacking from the back and side whenever you've got a good opportunity, or taking advantage of those blink and repulse abilities, allowing you to deal some hefty amounts of damage while the droid's open to your attacks. One of the deadliest droids you'll come face to face with is the Battle Droid, a heavily armed combat unit once designed to take on the Naytiba threat, only to be later consumed by it, now turning the machine against their former masters. Now these battle droids aren't puny little things that run around shouting Roger Roger, essentially being one of the most powerful droids in the game, packed out with some very serious firepower and weaponry. They're designed to both eliminate targets and defend themselves against oncoming attacks, by transitioning between offense and defense modes, retreating from battle when the going gets tough, only to rush back in when they've got a good opportunity to deal some damage, mixing up the flow of combat. They've not only got 2 wrist swords to slice you up with, allowing them to strike more viciously, but they're also armed with Stinger missile pods too, giving them explosive power that can target you over range. And having more ways to take you on means that you'll need to be more prepared for whatever the battle droid decides to throw at you next. The last Naytiba warrior in the list is a much more alien looking thing called the Lump, a creature that wouldn't look too out of place in a game like the Callisto Protocol. These mutated monsters are easily one of the weirdest and probably most disturbing enemy types, essentially being reanimated piles of rotting flesh and muscle, left over on the battlefield from the final war, morphed into a bit of a humanoid figure, along with a pair of huge tentacles sprouting out from either side of their massive heads. They might not be the most intelligent creatures, but they're still capable of using those tentacles to lash out up close, having slightly more range than your average enemy, with them extended outwards, acting like giant whips, slicing through the air in erratic patterns while slamming down on you from above. Their attacks can seem pretty ferocious, but they're not too hard to read, also giving you plenty of time in between their combos to deal some nice damage yourself, only for you to retreat to a safer distance when you suspect that the Lump's about to throw another tantrum. So next up are all the elite Naytiba types, which sort of act like the mini-bosses in Stellar Blade. These enemies are going to test your skills a bit more, and the first elite type you'll run into is the Brute, which is basically a hedge boar on steroids, being a much bigger variant with much more punishing attacks. Unlike the hedge boars, Brutes have traded those axe weapons in for a pair of electronic machine cores, which are fused into their arms, sort of looking like a ridiculously oversized pair of boxing gloves. These are what the Brutes are mainly going to use to bring the pain, acting like a pair of wrecking balls swinging around, with them both still housing electrical energy, which can be harnessed by the Brute and incorporated into its heavy attacks, slamming them down to produce deadly shockwaves on the floor. Most of the Brute's attacks consist of powerful lunges and punches, with them being a bit slower than some of the other elite Naytiba strikes, but still pretty brutal to get hit by, quickly wiping away huge chunks of health if you're not careful. Don't be fooled into thinking that you're safe over distance either, with them also able to dive through the air and smash into the ground, giving them attacks that can span over wide areas. As you wind the Brute up more over the course of the fight, it'll get even more aggressive and resort to channeling more of that energy from those machine cores, overloading them and making them much more volatile. This causes them to explode upon contact, emitting loads of shockwaves and fiery blasts as they smack the ground, ramping up the peril and making the fight much more dangerous. Just because the Brute's one of the earlier elites you'll encounter, don't write these guys off as an easy win. Next up is an elite called Abaddon, and this guy certainly is Abaddon. Looking like a giant mutated lizard dude with a spiky hoop for a head, its body's split open with hundreds of thorns sprouting out from the inside, and it's just about as badass as it looks, dual wielding a pair of massive barbed swords, while able to charge up attacks by harnessing electrical energy from those circular horns, sort of acting like a lightning rod. You can expect these guys to throw lots of rapid blade slashes and stabs at you, mainly using quick attack combos in close range, with the occasional dash thrown in for good measure too, possibly catching you out over a further distance. It might use a lot of speedy attacks, but a lot of these attacks can be foreseen and countered, providing you're quick enough to block or dodge before they land, letting you knock the creature off balance easier, opening it up to your own deadly combat maneuvers, allowing you to rip through Abaddon's health, which can give you a pretty big upper hand in a fight. Be careful not to get too carried away with your combos though, especially when the creature starts throwing more electrical attacks into the mix, as that energy can charge those swords up for deadlier strikes, also giving Abaddon more ways to attack over distance. Then it shoot lightning down to cover the arena, or blast energy projectiles and beams at you from its head. Having loads of different ways to take you on, using both melee weapons and elemental strikes, you'll need to keep moving and prepare for Abaddon's constant spam of short and long range attacks, using your own deadly blade to counter the Naytibas. Remember the Dozer from earlier on? Well, our next enemy type is basically an amped up version of one of those guys, with the Corruptor being a mutated variant, evolved to contaminate the land with harmful toxins. Their heads have been morphed into weird glowing blobs, with poisonous spines sticking out from them, though their bodies retain the same sort of structure as the Dozers, allowing them to be fast and agile while using that spiky needle head to enhance their overall lethality. You can expect them to use a lot of the same tricks as the Dozers, resorting to a lot of dash attacks and headbutt combos in close range, though having a head full of nasty toxin gives the Corruptor some new ways to catch you out, able to fire gooey projectiles through the air and use that poison to its advantage. Don't just expect the Corruptors to run around like headless chickens, trying to smack you senseless, as they'll often mix up their attack patterns, diving through the air, charging at you randomly, while lobbing those toxic balls at you in between. Sometimes even showering the place with contaminants, forcing you back away from the creature's position, making it awkward to advance while turning the place into a toxic wasteland. With all that said, you should be able to read a lot of their attacks easy enough, with you probably having plenty of experience fighting the Dozers. which these guys share a lot of the same moves and attacks with. Just keep the pressure on and use aggressive tactics to whittle down that health. So the Maelstrom is a pretty unique enemy you'll face, not only because it looks bloody weird, but because it's also a stationary creature that's unable to move around. This Naytiba is basically an epic fail, being the outcome of an experiment gone horribly wrong, merging together both human and Naytiba test subjects to form this twisted looking monstrosity. Basically a giant ball of flesh with a bunch of arms and heads jutting out from it. Pretty gross. Because you can't access your blade during Maelstrom fights, you'll need to rely on your trusty drone gun instead to take the thing out. With the creature being in a fixed position, you can expect it to return fire, using a variety of ranged attacks to counter your own. It might look like a complex fight on the face of it, but all you really need to do is gun down the Maelstrom's glowing weak spots, and then focus fire on its face once its gob lights up. Fairly straightforward. Of course, you gotta do all that while the thing chucks a ton of stuff your way. Contaminated blobs, floating orbs of doom, chunky laser beams, powerful shockwaves, and even those creepy test subjects that we covered earlier, littering the place with hazardous stuff to avoid, making an otherwise simple task just that little bit more chaotic. I'd probably advise sticking to the normal slugs for this fight, just because it gives you the fastest rate of fire, which will be handy for hitting those swaying weak spots. And if you run out of ammo, just shoot the test subjects wriggling around on the floor, as they're going to blow up and drop bullets, helping you to stay stocked up throughout the fight. One of the nippiest creatures you'll need to take down is the Stalker, basically a big alien lizard with a wacky chainsaw styled head. With its vision removed and its other senses heightened, the Stalker hunts its prey with relentless attacks, charging in with its arms waving around all over the place, lashing out with vicious flurries and rapid combos. It's a pretty wild and unpredictable beast, having swipes and slams that can be tricky to counter, down to the sheer amount of them, and down to its combos lasting longer than you're probably used to. Though this can also go in your favour if you're planning on knocking the creature off balance, having lots of attacks that you'll be able to parry, making it easy to initiate one of those deadly blade manoeuvres, knocking out huge chunks of its health in the process. When Stalkers aren't chasing you around attempting to scratch you to death, they'll likely be using that funky saw head to slice you up, dishing out loads of damage if you get caught by its blade. Probably a good idea to avoid getting picked up by the Stalker too, unless you want to be torn to shreds. Despite being really quick and agile, using a variety of dashes and pounces to close the gap, these guys also enjoy lobbing rocks at you over distance too, giving you yet another thing to try and avoid. They're naturally pretty dumb creatures though, literally having a hole in their heads, and so long as you can endure those frenzied combos, you'll have brief moments in between to strike back, keeping your distance when the Stalkers go into town with another mindless slash attack, only to rush in afterwards, have a nice window to deal some damage yourself. Those sculling critters normally compete with each other to take over a host, but in some cases, a bunch of them can share a corpse and contaminate it together, with the outcome being a monstrosity called the Juggernaut. A huge swollen bloke with a massive hammer, with his whole head being replaced by Naytiba flesh and a mass of writhing sculling tentacles. This guy chooses to wear several golden masks dotted all over his fat head, and being such a bulky creature kitted up with tactical military gear, this all makes the Juggernaut even tougher and more durable. Don't be fooled into thinking it's going to be a slow creature though, as although it's got a lot of heavy hammer swings and slams, it's a hell of a lot faster than it looks, using a lot of awkward attack variations to try and catch you out. Also able to push you away with kicks and shockwaves, disrupting your combos and keeping you at bay. Their attacks can be punishing and surprisingly unpredictable, though the tension will literally start to heat up a bit as the fight rages on. As when the Juggernaut becomes enraged, it'll ignite that hammer into a fireball, and incorporate even deadlier burning strikes, extending attack range while causing flames to erupt from the floor, making the whole area a hell of a lot more hazardous. You've definitely got to be respectful of the Juggernaut's power, constantly chipping away at its health while trying not to get smacked around too much. It's easy to get caught out by one of the creature's combos, but so long as you're careful and know when to retreat, you'll be able to get the job done, using all the tricks and skills you've learned so far. So we've already seen the lesser behemoth earlier on in the guide, and now it's time to check them out when they're all grown up, with the adult behemoth being a much bigger, stronger variant, now falling under the elite Naytiba category. Apart from sizing up and having a bit of a golden sheen to their skin, they don't really look all that much different from their younger counterparts, still essentially being a giant cat creature with a hand for a head, but now having heavier attacks and a lot more health, and a few new tricks to try and throw you off. You can expect the behemoth to come rushing over with rapid claw slashes and pounce attacks, merely relying on aggressive close range strikes, with most of the damage coming from those massive claws. The behemoth can cover some pretty long distances though, while jumping through the air, so just because you're standing on the other side of the arena doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe. Unlike the weaker variants, the big guys can also launch sonic booms in your direction, and they're also capable of generating shockwaves on the floor, creating more hazards that you'll need to dodge. This gives the behemoth more power over range, giving it other options to cover wider distances. So although it'll fight in a similar way to the lesser ones, it'll definitely put you under more pressure. Though thankfully, a lot of those claw strikes can be easily parried, often interrupting the creature's combos, plus letting you get some damage against it yourself. We always dread going up against enemies in video games that can regenerate health, and Stellar Blade just so happens to have one of those enemies, in the form of the highly advanced combat droid called Belial, a hate-fueled war robot taken over by the Naytiba corruption. This thing looks a lot more vicious and malevolent than any of the other droids you'll see in the game, standing tall while having Naytiba flesh to form muscle structure and limbs. The first time you'll run into it, Belial's going to be dual wielding a pair of huge serrated saws, rushing over with a lot of fast, frantic slashing attacks while being agile enough to avoid a lot of groan. The first phase comes to a halt pretty early on though, as you chop its mechanical arm off, forcing it to retreat like a bloody coward. Probably a smart move for the droid though, returning later on to continue the fight, only now with a regenerated limb, made from Naytiba biomatter, which is even morphed into a new weapon that can be used independently from the other one, or even combined with it to form a slower, deadlier greatsword. Having two weapon configurations gives Belial access to even more attack combos, some that are faster and more frenzied, along with others that are steadier but hit like a truck. Just when you think you've had an easy victory and wiped out all of the droid's health, it'll regenerate to gain it all back, now able to throw new attacks into the mix which can spread contaminated liquid. You've basically got to whittle that health bar down 3 times, which will allow your railgun to be supercharged. The only thing that's going to stop this pest once and for all, ripping Belial in half, putting an end to its hellbent mission to hunt you down. Now our next enemy is definitely on the freaky side, looking like something that's just casually wandered over from Resident Evil. The Karakori is a different line of robot to the typical droids we're used to seeing, specifically used for service inside the orbit elevator. But like most things in Stellar Blade, they've become contaminated, merging with each other to create a very twisted monster. Being a disturbing cocktail of robot parts and Naytiba flesh, the Karakori basically acts like a puppet controlled by the contamination, scurrying around the place on mechanical limbs, with a giant spider-like hand acting as a melee weapon. It'll try and slap you around, using a variety of different hand swipes and slams, though these shouldn't be too hard to read, so you should be able to parry and dodge quite a lot of them providing you're paying attention and not getting too ballsy. Karakori does rely on that claw most of the time, but it's also got quite a few sneaky tricks up its sleeve too. Screaming to generate destructive sound waves, being able to spawn Kokeshi drones, acting as a distraction to complicate the fight, and let's not forget about that laser cannon fitted within Karakori's mouth, which occasionally sweeps around the room, forcing you to jump into the air to avoid getting zapped. It's a pretty fast and frantic battle, having lots of stuff to focus on at once, but many of the creature's attacks can be foreseen and countered, as long as you're patient and get into a rhythm with your blocks and dodges. Nevertheless, it's a pretty fun and satisfying fight, having quite a few unique elements thrown into the mix to spice things up a bit. The last elite Naytiba you'll come across is easily one of the game's weirdest, which says quite a lot considering what we've seen so far. The Democrawler's got mechanical crab legs with a bunch of alien-like tentacles sprouting out from underneath its body, and a massive head comprising of human faces, basically a huge mass of infected corpses all fused together, looking like some kind of creepy frog spawn from hell. If that's not weird enough, this thing's also got a halo of light hovering above it, giving the creature futuristic abilities and energy attacks, which become more aggressive as the fight goes on. But much like with our last enemy, this guy's also got a massive hand used for slapping you around, which tends to be its primary way of attacking, at least near the start. Well up until it decides to pull a huge sword out of its backside and go on to attack you with that instead. And as you probably expect, that sword's going to be much better at dishing out the pain. Over time, the Democrawler is going to rely much more on those cybernetic abilities, teleporting around the arena to protect itself while using a bunch of wacky energy attacks too, generating loads of light portals on the floor, which you'll need to be careful not to step on, sending volleys of energy projectiles through the air which lock onto your position like heat-seeking missiles, using some pretty gnarly ground pound attacks, generating shockwaves which can absolutely decimate your health bar, slapping you with, yep, even more laser beams, just can't get enough of those, the list goes on, all while it's swinging that massive sword around in between. Because the Democrawler uses quite a lot of ranged attacks, it can be best to try and stick close to it, where you can parry its strikes and stun it, letting you stab the living crap out of it to whittle that health down even more. You'll definitely have to stay vigilant in this fight, being one of the toughest of all the elite Naytibas, even matching up with the likes of the Alphas, some of the game's toughest boss battles. Speaking of Alpha Naytibas, I'm going to be running over those next, but I should probably warn you that this is where things start to get a little bit more linked in with the story, so the next couple of sections will have some spoilers in there. Do be warned. The first alpha you'll have to confront is basically the Naytiba equivalent to King Kong, a massive stone-like gorilla creature known as Gygus, with a huge rotating wheel for a head which sort of acts like a giant grinder that can be used to mash you up. It'll move and attack like a big ape, pummeling you with jabs and punches while slamming the ground with its hands to produce shockwaves on the floor. Despite its size, Gygus is a surprisingly agile enemy, capable of dashing around the arena and launching itself through the air to cover wide distances quickly, not only letting it close the gap to beat you down up close, but also flatten you into the dirt as it lands, using its hefty momentum and destructive power in any way possible to dish out some damage, even if that means throwing rocks and debris at you over range, something else that Gygus tends to do quite a lot in between trying to smack you around up close. You've mainly got to watch out for a lot of fast combos and swiping lunges, especially as the fight goes on, with Gygus getting more wound up and going on more of a rampage. Those attacks will come at you quicker and more relentlessly, though this does at least give you more opportunities to parry its strikes, staggering the creature, thus opening it up to its own retribution attack, which will delete huge chunks of the Naytiba's health. Eventually you'll deal enough damage to stab the creature in the head, slicing a huge section of that wheel off, and go on to retrieve the alpha core, residing within its centre. One down, a few more to go. Gygus can actually be fought again later on, with another subspecies variant popping up in the wasteland, basically being the same sort of fight but with even more ferocity and power, making it a tougher battle than the first time around. So pretty much right at the start of the game, your fellow squad mate Taki gets butchered by a freaky Naytiba that sorta looks like an angel of death, sacrificing herself to save your life. That's not the last time you'll see Taki though, re-emerging later on after being contaminated by an alpha core, presumably implanted by the Naytiba that killed her, now putting Taki in a corrupted, hostile state. Now pitted against your former ally, you'll need to take her on in a pretty brutal fight spanning over several phases, enhanced by that alpha core, while given a mechanical exosuit, which looks pretty badass. Not to mention the fact that she's also got a ridiculously long katana-like sword too, which is capable of shredding through your health bar in a matter of seconds, with those blade slashes being fast and potentially very punishing. It's generally best to be more aggressive near the start, but still ready to tackle those deadly sword combos in between. The second phase of the fight initiates when Taki whips out a mechanical wing, adding new attacks into the fray, now having ways to strike over range, being able to launch energy waves by charging up that sword. Blade slashes are still going to be the main thing you'll need to avoid and parry here, so try your best to read her movements and predict what combo's coming up next. The third and final phase kicks off after falling down into another area, with Taki revealing an Naytiba tentacle which sort of acts like another wing. That creepy skull mask is also going to come off too, letting you know that she means business. Now this is where the fun begins, with Taki becoming a complete and utter savage, throwing all sorts of blade combos, dashes and awkward stuff to avoid, putting you under even more pressure. She can now hover and strike from the air, making it tricky to hit with your melee attacks, and just to round things off, she's also got the ability to teleport too, another thing you'll need to be aware of that might catch you out. Once all of that hell's been whittled down, you'll retrieve the alpha core, but of course, kill Taki for good in the process, but only after she temporarily regains consciousness to say some final goodbyes, now being free from the Naytiba's infection. By far the biggest Naytiba in the game is an absolutely massive creature called the Demogorgon, found clinging onto the top of the orbit elevator trying to take control of its central core. It might be the largest by a long shot, but it also just so happens to be one of the easiest to fight, because despite being a hulking mass of tentacles and wings, it's got no way to actually attack you after you've been thrust into space. The only way to kill this thing is by overcharging your railgun and blasting it towards the monster's eyes, with those all acting as weak spots, eventually forcing its main eye to open up. With the rest of the Demogorgon covered in hardened skin, shooting that main eye is the only way to actually kill it, with that supercharged beam tearing right the way through the creature's body. But unfortunately, this will cause the alpha core to float off into space in the process, unable to be retrieved and used to form the master core. The next alpha Naytiba is the one from the very start, that angel of death that killed and corrupted Taki, later found attacking the city of Zion, back to give you one of the toughest fights in the game. This unidentified Naytiba is basically a big evil raven-like harpy, covered in black feathers, long wings, and a pair of sickle-like appendages, morphed into its hands. This Naytiba attacks with brutal slashes and frenzied melee combos, being pretty fast and awkward to read, having the ability to both hover around and teleport to new locations, not only allowing it to attack from unexpected angles, but also preventing you from landing hits yourself. It can manipulate the corruption by creating deadly puddles on the floor, and even generate black fog, which travels over distance too, both attacks that can hit you after the Naytiba retreats further away. Having such a wide variety of both close and longer ranged abilities definitely forces you to stay on your toes, with a lot of them being potentially fatal, incorporating strikes that can knock out huge blocks of health, with rapid combos that can be pretty tricky to counter and dodge. Projectiles are going to be flying at you left, right and centre, constantly giving you stuff to avoid. But you've really got to watch out for the glowing yellow orbs, which will slowly float around and can instantly kill you if you don't shoot them down in time. Definitely something you'll need to take seriously. Though do keep in mind that destroying these is going to drain all of the Naytiba's stamina, giving you a brief opening to rush in and strike while it's temporarily helpless lying on the floor. Just like most of the other Naytiba fights, this is only going to get harder as it rolls on, having more and more ways to attack while switching up previous attack patterns to try and throw you off guard. Though you'll eventually get to slice the thing to pieces while it's flapping around in the air, severing its wings and hacking into its body. Though lo and behold, it's no coincidence that this thing looks like a demented raven, because it does actually turn out to be Raven in Naytiba form, a former member of the 2nd Airborne Squad, now fueled with hatred and rage, working with the Elder to destroy Mother Sphere, and basically anything else that gets in the way. So Raven manages to slip away from all the chaos she's just caused after destroying much of Zion and causing lots of casualties, with one of those casualties being Orkul, the old guy attached to a load of machine parts who's been guiding you on your mission and helping you locate the Alpha Cores. As it turns out, he's been hiding a little secret all this time, not only being a Naytiba himself, but also being the very first Alpha variant to be created, once a deadly threat towards humanity, now a peaceful dude choosing to help the citizens of Zion. Because you need 4 Alpha Cores to create the Master Core, and with the one from the Demogorgon being lost to space, Orkul performs one last act of kindness by giving you his own Alpha Core while he's on his deathbed, allowing you to venture on and hunt down the Elder variant, now having the 4 cores you need. This isn't a big fight or anything, but he is still technically an Alpha Naytiba, so he's probably worth mentioning. But before you can locate the Elder, you've still got some unfinished business to attend to. You might have defeated Raven in Naytiba form, but she's going to come back for round 2, only this time without the freaky bird costume. Essentially being another member of Airborne Squad, fighting Raven is basically like fighting an alternate version of yourself, having the same sort of skill set while being armed with similar weapons and abilities, matching yours while throwing some other stuff into the mix too. It's a pretty fast-paced battle with lots of rapid combos and quick maneuvers, with Raven zipping around the place using teleportation, dashing in to use sword strikes up close. That Cryo Blade can also emit icy waves which travel at you over distance, though because she specialises in close quarter combat, most of the attacks you'll need to worry about come in the form of slashes and blade frenzies. Though it's the second phase of the fight where Raven really starts to up the tempo, not only chaining attacks together much faster, but also countering your own, even able to block some of your beta abilities to prevent taking damage. You're going to need to think and act quickly to counter whatever trick she throws at you next, with attacks coming thick and fast, leaving you with barely any time to escape and heal up. For this reason, it can be a pretty good tactic to use a burst ability and then use your healing equipment while Raven's knocked down on the floor. Also reserving burst skills to counter some of those nasty combos that get thrown at you later on. Once you've managed to deplete all of Raven's health, you'll chop off her arms, stab her in the stomach, severing her exospine, and basically leave her in a pretty messed up state. Let's put it this way, she's not going to be getting back up for round 3 anytime soon. So one last spoiler warning before we get on to the final bosses. There's 2 different ones, depending on your decision at the end, and they both have different outcomes on the story. Consider yourself warned. So the big plot twist at the end, the guy who's been helping you out over the course of the game, turns out to be the Elder Naytiba all along. Adam created Mother Sphere, the hyper-advanced AI that went rogue, manufacturing androids called the Androidos, to populate the world as a replacement for humans, the category which you fall into. But he also created the Naytibas, which have been at war with Mother Sphere, plunging the world into darkness and chaos. In order to save humanity, he plans to fuse with Eve, who's considered to be the most genetically advanced android created by Mother Sphere, and combine their powers to achieve a godlike symbiosis. Though by refusing his request, and sticking to your original order to bring him down, you'll then be choosing him as the final boss, which I suppose is your main goal throughout the game all along. Adam doesn't actually fight you in the first phase, retreating from battle and pushing you away as a means to defend himself against your attacks. Though after he's gotten a bit fed up of being sliced by a blade, he'll resort to becoming the Elder Naytiba, transforming into a much more powerful being which is capable of taking you on. The Elder basically comes in the form of a giant angel-looking creature, covered in thick white and gold armour, while having multiple wings and arms holding spear-type weapons to use in combat. These form the bulk of his primary attacks, with both those spears and wings being used to jab, slash and smack you around during heavy combos and lunges, some of which can be tricky to read and counter due to them being awkwardly staggered. But being the top dog of all the Naytiba, able to harness and control the power of light, you've also got to watch out for a lot of ranged energy-based attacks coming your way too. From shockwaves, sharp projectiles, beams, floaty light balls, and all sorts of other stuff in between. One of those being the dreaded insta-kill orbs that need to be shot down in order to stop them killing you outright, which, when destroyed, gives you a brief opportunity to rush in and perform a cool little stab attack while he's stunned. The Elder's going to resort more and more to those strong light abilities as the fight rages on, often charging in with those spears to deal damage, forcing you back and preventing you from going too wild up close. But once you eventually wipe away all of that health, you'll activate your tacky powers and finish the Elder off for good, by slicing off his arms, hacking him to bits, and basically stab the living crap out of him, destroying Adam's Elder Naytiba form while killing Adam in the process. Just what Mother Sphere intended you to do all along. But let's rewind a bit and say that you chose to unite with Adam instead. This will combine both of your powers to create the perfect hybrid, becoming a force capable of taking down Mother Sphere for humanity's salvation. Though as you'd probably expect, Mother Sphere isn't exactly thrilled with this decision and so decides to hack Providence, Lily's exosuit, and use that to try and destroy Eve before she gets a chance to utilise her newly acquired power, with that heavily armed mech being packed full of deadly weaponry now becoming the game's final boss, instead of Adam in the form of the Elder Naytiba. Providence is a war machine, and a very effective one at that, capable of punching its way through most situations with both of its arms being fitted with tachyon blades. It's got a lot of physical power, using its fists to perform rapid attack combos, waving its arms around and slamming them into the ground to generate dangerous shockwaves on the floor. Like many of the other bosses, Providence attacks quickly and relentlessly, but having access to a wide array of weapons from laser beams, guns, missile launchers and energy bombs, there's going to be a hell of a lot you'll need to watch out for, along with all those close range melee combos too of course, many of which are staggered and very tricky to read. Having all that firepower is one thing, but being such an advanced machine also allows it to be very accurate too, bombarding you with loads of stuff to avoid, forcing you to dodge everything that flies your way, using all your skills, equipment and fast reflexes to prevent getting hit, which can potentially be fatal if you make a few mistakes in a row. Speaking of fatal, Providence can also use another insta-kill attack too, conjuring up energy wings that need to be shot down in order to stop it charging up power and wiping you out immediately if successful. Thankfully these are all pretty close together though, so they're not too hard to miss. Once you've endured the mech's brutal onslaught and caused enough damage yourself, you'll automatically go into tacky mode to finish off the last part of the fight, basically using all of your power to overcome Providence. You're invincible during this bit, so you can breathe a little bit easier, though you will be on a timer counting down over 2 minutes, so it's probably best not to hang around. And once you've depleted all of that health bar completely, you'll go on to slice and dice the exosuit, flying around the place while chopping it up into pieces, basically turning it into scrap metal. Job well done, go get yourself a beer. That might be the end of Providence, but not long after, Mother Sphere sends an army of androids your way, which you'll be able to cut through without any hassle, letting you play around with that newly acquired power, nicely closing the game to the end credits, along with this super long video. If you're still watching, thanks for sticking around. So those are all the enemy types and Naytibas in Stellar Blade. There was a lot to run through in this one, but we got there in the end. Hope you enjoyed the guide and found it useful. Hit that thumbs up button if you did, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you want to see more enemy guides on other games, feel free to check out my channel and subscribe to stay updated with lots of new videos coming up in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.